always thought the woods behind our house were just woods, quiet, peaceful, filled with trails and a few creeks. Nothing ever seemed strange about them until this summer I found the treehouse. What I thought was just an old, forgotten structure turned into something much darker. And now I can't close my eyes without seeing it. It all started on a lazy July afternoon. I was 15, bored and looking for something to do. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on the dense forest canopy. I decided to head into the woods, hoping to find some adventure. The trees were familiar, comforting even as I wandered deeper than usual. That's when I saw it. At first, it didn't seem real. Perched high in an enormous oak tree was a treehouse. Its wood was darkened with age vines, snaking up the sides as if the forest had been trying to reclaim it. The ladder leading up was rough and uneven, clearly handmade. I stopped in my tracks staring at it. Something about it felt wrong. The air around it was still. No rustling leaves, no birds singing, just silence. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. As I climbed the ladder, I noticed the wood felt damp, even though it hadn't rained in days. My palms left smudges on the rungs, and I tried not to think about how each step creaked beneath my weight. When I pulled myself onto the platform, I immediately felt it. The air inside the treehouse was freezing cold, the type of cold that made your breath visible even though it was the middle of summer. The floor was scattered with leaves and dirt, but what caught my attention was a small wooden chest sitting in the corner. It looked out of place, almost too pristine compared to the decayed walls around it. I hesitated, but eventually moved toward the chest. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, I found a stack of old photographs. Black and white images faded with time. They showed children sitting on the edge of the treehouse smiling, but their eyes looked strange, hollow, almost lifeless. As I stared at the photos, I felt the temperature drop even further. A faint whisper drifted through the air, but I couldn't make out the words. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, but there was no one there. That's when I noticed the window, a small square cut into the treehouse wall. Outside, the forest looked darker than it had when I arrived. The light seemed to fade as if the treehouse was drawing the day into itself. My breath caught as I saw something move between the trees. It was just a shadow at first, but it was deliberate, slow, the kind of movement that made your stomach drop because you knew you weren't alone. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but deep down I knew better. I backed away from the window, clutching the photos in my hand. The whispers grew louder this time, more distinct. "Get out," they seemed to say. My legs shook as I approached the ladder, desperate to leave. As I stepped onto the first rung, a loud creak echoed through the treehouse. It sounded like something heavy had moved inside. I turned my head slowly. The chest was no longer in the corner. It was now in the center of the room, its lid wide open. Panic surged through me. I climbed down as fast as I could, nearly slipping on the damp rungs. My feet hit the ground and I ran, not daring to look back. The forest felt different as I sprinted home. The trees seemed closer, the air heavier. When I burst into the house, my mom gave me a worried look. I tried to explain, but the words didn't come out right. I just kept saying the treehouse over and over. She didn't understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photographs, the children's hollow eyes staring back at me. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the window, but then it grew louder. It was coming from my window. I pulled the covers over my head, shaking as the tapping continued. Then it stopped. The silence was worse. I peeked out from under the blanket and nearly screamed. The figure stood outside my window, pale, thin, with hollow black eyes. It didn't move, just stared. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't standing on the ground. It was floating. I didn't sleep that night, but morning the figure was gone. The sense of dread lingered. I decided to go back to the treehouse. I had to know what was happening. When I reached the clearing, my stomach dropped. The treehouse was gone. The tree itself was still there, massive and ancient, but there was no sign of the structure. No ladder, no chest. I searched for hours, circling the tree, combing the area, but it was as if the treehouse had never existed. When I returned home, I found the photos sitting on my bed. The chest was there too. I moved out of that house years ago, but the memories never left. The photos disappeared one day without explanation, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again, and I know it's still watching. If you ever find a tree house in the woods, leave it alone. Some things are meant to stay hidden. The first time I saw the treehouse, I thought I was losing my mind. It wasn't supposed to be there. My family had lived on this property for years, and I'd wandered those woods 1,000 times. But one afternoon, there it was, perched high in the branches of an old oak tree, like it had always been waiting for someone. I couldn't stop staring at it. The structure looked ancient, the wood dark and splintered. Vines crawled up its legs, as if the forest was trying to pull it back into the earth. But the strangest thing was that I felt it, watching me, not the other way around. Curiosity got the better of me. Ignoring the pit in my stomach, I stepped closer. A rope ladder dangled from the platform. It looked as though it could fall apart with a single tug, but it held firm when I tested it. My hands trembled as I started to climb. Each step felt heavier than the last. The higher I went, the colder the air became. By the time I reached the top, my breath came out in visible puffs. Summer sunlight filtered weakly through the leaves, casting odd shadows on the wooden floor. Inside the treehouse, the air was unnaturally still. The walls were carved with strange symbols. At first, I thought they were childish scribbles, but the longer I stared, the more deliberate they seemed. In the center of the room lay an object wrapped in a tattered piece of cloth. Against my better judgment, I unfolded it. It was a doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, its eyes black pits. It looked as though it had been buried for decades. As I held it, a chill swept through me, and I could swear I heard faint laughter coming from the woods below. I dropped the doll and spun around. The treehouse felt smaller now, almost suffocating. My heart raced as I backed toward the ladder, but as I turned, I saw something carved into the wood beside it. That night, as I lay in bed, the tapping began, faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from my bedroom window. I pulled the blanket over my head, refusing to look. The next morning, the tapping stopped. I cautiously pulled the curtain back, but there was nothing there. No tracks, no signs of anything. But when I turned my head, I saw it. The doll was sitting on my dresser, its cracked face turned toward me. I ran back to the woods, determined to destroy the treehouse. But when I reached the spot where it had stood, the tree was bare. No ladder, no platform, no trace that it had ever existed. I burned the doll in the backyard, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes at night, I hear that faint laughter again, and I know it's still out there. If you ever find a treehouse where it shouldn't be, don't climb it. Some things are better left untouched. It was the summer I turned 14 when I discovered the treehouse. I had always loved exploring the woods behind our house, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found. It wasn't like the usual abandoned buildings or old hunting cabins I'd come across over the years. No, this treehouse was different. The moment I climbed the ladder to the rickety wooden platform, I felt something watching me, something I couldn't see but I could feel deep in my bones. It's not a story I tell often, but I can't shake the memory of what happened that day. If you ever find a treehouse in the woods, turn around and walk away. It's not meant for you. It all started on a lazy afternoon. I was bored, alone, and had nothing better to do. The heat from the sun made everything feel sluggish and still. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I spotted something odd through the trees. A flash of wood, a structure that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't part of the trail or any property I recognized. Curiosity pulled me toward it. I followed the overgrown path leading deeper into the woods. The further I walked, the quieter it got. There was no sound of birds or the rustling of leaves, just an oppressive silence that wrapped around me like a thick blanket. That's when I saw it. The treehouse. Perched high in the branches of a massive oak tree, the treehouse looked ancient, almost forgotten by time. The wooden walls were weathered and the ladder leading up to it was covered in moss and vines. It looked like no one had been there in years. The strange thing was, there were no signs that anyone had built it. No construction marks, no sign of a recent project. It just was there. My heart raced with a mixture of excitement and dread. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around, but my feet kept moving toward the base of the tree. Without thinking too much about it, I began to climb the rickety ladder. Each step creaked under my weight, and I gripped the edges of the ladder tightly, as if it might give way any second. When I reached the top, I pulled myself onto the platform. The floor was dusty and covered in a blanket of leaves and pine needles. It was dim inside the small wooden room. The walls were cracked in places, and I could see holes where the wood had rotted away, but it didn't matter. What stood out to me more was the feeling, that cold, uneasy feeling that settled over me like a thick fog. It was as though the treehouse was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I walked around the space, trying to shake off this strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. That's when I saw it. A small object lying in the corner, half hidden by a pile of old leaves and sticks. At first, I thought it was just some trash left behind by whoever built the treehouse. But when I picked it up, I realized it was something much worse. It was a doll, a small porcelain doll with a cracked face and hair matted with dirt. The eyes were hollow and black. It looked like it had been there for years. I felt a chill run through me as I stared at the doll. There was something about it, something unsettling. My skin prickled with an urge to throw it back down, but I couldn't bring myself to. I stood there, holding it for a few moments too long. That's when I heard it. A soft creak. I froze. The noise came from below. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the tree, but then the creak came again, followed by a soft rustling sound. It was too deliberate to be the wind. Someone, or something, was below me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't dare. For a long time, everything was silent again. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from below. I slowly crept to the edge of the treehouse and peeked down. Nothing. Just the thick forest stretching on below. I sighed in relief, thinking maybe I had imagined it. But then a voice spoke from the shadows. "Put it down." I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I spun around. No one was there. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Put it down." I felt a cold shiver run up my spine. I turned back toward the corner where I had found the doll. It still sat there in my hands, but there was no one there. The voice spoke from the still-houred scene. I turned back toward the corner where I had found the doll. Then I tried to shake off the sense of dread that had settled in my stomach. I wasn't about to let a voice scare me. I tossed the doll back into the corner and stepped away. The moment I did, the air grew even colder, like a sudden drop in temperature had consumed the treehouse. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck and a whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Don't leave." I whipped around, but no one was there. The hairs on my arms stood up and my heart began to race. Something wasn't right. I needed to leave. Fast. I turned to climb back down the ladder, but as I did, I felt a sudden weight pressing down on my chest. The air thickened. My breath became labored. I glanced back at the treehouse, and in that split second, I saw something, or someone, peering out from the window. A pale face with wide, dark eyes staring at me. I stumbled backward, nearly falling off the ladder. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, like it was waiting for me to make a wrong move. I scrambled down the ladder, my feet slipping on the wet rungs. I reached the ground and ran. I didn't stop running until I was back at my house. The treehouse was gone when I returned the next day, or at least it was no longer where it had been. I walked the same path into the woods. But when I reached the place where the treehouse had stood, there was nothing but a small clearing. My friends thought I was crazy when I told them, but I know what I saw. The doll? I burned it. But the nightmares didn't stop. For weeks, I couldn't escape the image of that pale face staring at me from the treehouse window, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whisper again, "Don't leave." That treehouse was no accident. It wasn't built by children or adventurers. Something darker made it, something ancient. All I know is that I never want to go back to those woods again. If you ever find yourself near an abandoned treehouse in the woods, trust me, walk away. You might not be as lucky as I was.